The air in Augusta on that May night of 2002 carried the warmth of the South, thick with honeysuckle and distant laughter. It was prom night, the night every senior had waited for, and the night that would change everything. Emma Caldwell, bright, kind, and endlessly curious, disappeared somewhere between the glittering dance floor and the quiet back roads leading home. 20 years later, the town still whispers her name. Some say she ran away, others that something darker happened near the old quarry. But for Sarah Monroe, the truth had never left her mind. She had been Emma's best friend, the girl who promised to stay by her side no matter what. That promise haunted her every time she drove past the faded "Welcome to Augusta" sign. Now 28, Sarah had returned, not as the girl who once left, but as a journalist with unfinished business. Her car hummed softly as she crossed the bridge into town. The river shimmered beneath, reflecting the sunset, like a memory refusing to fade. Augusta looked almost the same: white porches, rocking chairs, the smell of fried catfish drifting from Ray's diner. Yet everything felt smaller, quieter, as if the town itself had chosen silence over truth. Sarah parked beside the old diner and stepped out, brushing red dust from her jeans. Inside, familiar faces glanced up. Conversations paused. "Sarah Monroe?" asked a woman from the counter, Becky Taylor, once their class president. Her voice carried disbelief and a trace of pity. "Hey, Becky," Sarah replied softly. "It's been a while." Becky forced a smile. "Didn't think you'd come back after everything." Sarah nodded, eyes fixed on the coffee pot steaming behind her. "I had to," she said. "Some things don't stay buried." That night, in the small motel room she rented off Washington Road, Sarah unpacked a single box. Inside lay photographs from senior year. Emma in her pale blue dress, laughing beside her old Mustang, the two of them arm in arm, full of hope. Sarah traced Emma's smile with her thumb. "I'm going to find out what happened," she whispered. "I owe you that much." The cicadas outside hummed a steady rhythm, like the ticking of an unseen clock counting down. Tomorrow she would start where it all began, the high school gym where the prom had taken place, the last place Emma was seen alive. But tonight, Sarah sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker over cracked sidewalks. She remembered the music, the sparkle of lights, and how Emma had turned to her before leaving the dance floor, saying she'd be right back. She never was. 20 years later, Sarah would finally ask the question everyone else had learned to avoid. Who wanted Emma Caldwell to disappear? If you're ready to uncover the truth buried beneath 2 decades of silence, subscribe to the channel now, because what Sarah is about to find will shake Augusta to its core. Morning light crept through the blinds of Sarah's motel room, streaking across the worn carpet. She hadn't slept much. The familiar sound of cicadas and the distant hum of trucks on Washington Road pulled her back to the same rhythm she'd known growing up in Augusta. The day she had dreaded for 20 years had arrived, her return to the place that kept more ghosts than people cared to admit. The high school stood at the end of a quiet road lined with pecan trees. The building looked tired now, its brick faded, its windows clouded with dust. Sarah parked and stepped out, heart pounding at the sight of the gym where it all ended. The once bright banner reading Augusta High Tigers, class of 2002, was long gone, but in her memory it still hung proudly over the double doors. Inside, the air was thick and still. Her footsteps echoed across the empty floor, where glitter from that long-ago prom still clung to cracks between the tiles. She closed her eyes for a moment, hearing the faint echo of laughter, the slow rhythm of "I don't want to miss a thing" playing over cheap speakers, and Emma's voice teasing her about her awkward dance moves. "Thought I'd find you here," came a voice from the doorway. Sarah turned sharply. Coach Daniel stood there, older now, with more grey than she remembered, but the same kind eyes. "Coach," she said, forcing a small smile. "Didn't think anyone still came around." He shrugged. "I've been taking care of this place. Hard to let go, you know." His gaze softened. "You were one of the good ones, Sarah." "Emma, too." Sarah hesitated, then asked, "Do you remember that night?" He sighed deeply. "I remember the music, the kids dancing, laughing, Emma leaving early with that boy of hers, Mark Rivers. Everyone thought she'd be fine. She was always the responsible one. Mark Rivers. The name alone brought a rush of images. His easy smile, his Letterman jacket, the way he used to hold Emma's hand like he'd never let go. Now, 2 decades later, he was Deputy Rivers. As Sarah left the gym, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number flashed across the screen. "You shouldn't have come back." Her breath caught. She looked around, but the parking lot was empty except for her car, and a few stray leaves tumbling across the pavement. She tucked the phone into her pocket, jaw tight. "You'll have to try harder than that," she muttered. Driving through downtown Augusta, she couldn't shake the image of the gym floor. The faint shimmer of glitter, the ghost of music. The past felt closer than ever, whispering through every street and familiar face she passed. That evening she stopped by Ray's Diner again. The scent of coffee and fried catfish filled the air. Mark Rivers sat alone in a booth, uniform crisp, expression unreadable. For a moment Sarah froze. He looked up and met her gaze. "You're back," he said. "I am," she replied evenly. "And I'm not leaving this time." His eyes darkened, the weight of unspoken history settling between them. "Be careful where you dig, Sarah. Some things were meant to stay buried." But Sarah only smiled faintly. Maybe, or maybe it's time Augusta remembered. Rain tapped softly against the motel window the next morning, a steady rhythm that matched Sarah's thoughts. She sat at the small desk, flipping through an old box she had found in her mother's attic the night before. Most of it was junk. Graduation programs, ticket stubs, faded notes, but at the bottom lay something she hadn't seen in decades, her old disposable Kodak camera. Her breath caught as she turned it over in her hands. The yellow plastic was scratched, the film advance wheel stiff with age. It was the same camera she'd carried on prom night. Somehow she had forgotten it even existed. Curiosity replaced hesitation. That afternoon, she drove to a small photo lab tucked behind a laundromat on Broad Street. The place smelled faintly of chemicals and nostalgia. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. Jenkins, squinted behind his glasses when she handed over the camera. "Been a while since I've seen one of these," he said. "Give me a day, maybe 2. "Can you make it today?" Sarah asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "It's important." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Come back before closing." The hours crawled. Sarah spent the afternoon at the public library, reviewing archived newspapers from 2002. Every headline about Emma's disappearance read the same: "Local girl missing after prom." No leads. There were no follow-ups, no press conferences, no photographs beyond her senior portrait. It was as if the investigation had been quietly erased. When Sarah returned to the lab, Mr. Jenkins was waiting, a thin envelope in his hand. "Some of these are a bit dark," he said, handing it over. "But one of them, well, you'll want to see for yourself." She thanked him and walked back to her car, rain misting her hair. Sitting behind the wheel, she slid the photos out. The first few were ordinary, smiling faces, paper crowns, glittery dresses. Then came the last photo. Her hand trembled. It showed Emma, standing near her blue Mustang in the parking lot. Her smile was gone. She was arguing with someone, a shadowed figure whose face was half turned away. The photo had captured only part of a badge on the person's belt and the edge of a dark uniform. Sarah's pulse quickened. That detail hadn't been in the official police records. She would have remembered. She zoomed in on the photo using her phone's flashlight. The reflection of the gym's lights revealed something else. Emma's wristwatch, the one found weeks later near the quarry, still visible in that moment. That meant the photo had been taken minutes before she vanished. Sarah sat back, heart pounding. "Who were you talking to, Emma?" she whispered. Her first instinct was to call the police, but then she remembered Mark's warning the night before. "Be careful where you dig." He had sounded more frightened than threatening. Still, fear had no place now. She slipped the photo into a folder marked Evidence and stared out at the rain-darkened streets of Augusta. Somewhere out there was the truth, captured on film 20 years ago, waiting for someone brave enough to see it clearly. Tomorrow, she'd take the photo to Mark. Whatever he knew, It was time he said it out loud. The next morning broke grey and humid, clouds hanging low over Augusta like a warning. Sarah sat in her car outside the sheriff's office, the photograph of Emma clutched in her hand. The faint image of the uniform in that picture had haunted her all night. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling that the answer was closer than she wanted to believe. Inside, the office smelled of coffee and old paper. Deputies moved through the halls with polite nods, but their eyes lingered a little too long. Everyone knew why she was there. Everyone remembered. Mark Rivers stepped out of a small office, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent light. He looked older than his 38 years, his shoulders tense, jaw set. "Sarah," he said, motioning her into the room. "You could have called." "I thought it'd be better in person," she replied, sliding the photograph across his desk. "You tell me what you see." Mark stared at it for a long time. His hand trembled slightly before he set it down. "Where did you get this?" "From my old camera. I developed the film yesterday." He leaned back, exhaling slowly. This shouldn't exist. The case file never mentioned a photo." "Exactly," Sarah said. "So why wasn't it there?" Mark hesitated, rubbing a hand over his face. "You don't understand how things worked back then." The sheriff's department was under pressure. Everyone wanted answers, and when none came, people stopped asking. Sarah's voice hardened, or someone made sure they stopped asking. His eyes met hers, a flash of guilt flickering beneath the surface. "You're chasing something that'll only hurt people, Sarah. Leave it alone." "I can't," she said quietly. "I owe her the truth." Mark stood, pacing. "You think I don't? I loved her, Sarah. She was my whole world back then. Losing her ruined everything." His voice cracked, then steadied. "But what you're doing, it'll bring out things this town doesn't want to face." "Then maybe it's time they did." He turned toward the window, rain streaking down the glass like years of silence finally breaking. "There are things you don't know. Things that could destroy lives. Good people, innocent families." Sarah's patience thinned. If they were innocent, they wouldn't be afraid of the truth. For a long moment, only the hum of the air conditioner filled the space. Finally, Mark said, "Go talk to Lorraine Caldwell, Emma's mom. She might have something that'll help you." But after that, stop. Sarah studied him, trying to read what he wasn't saying. "You're warning me or protecting me?" "Both," he said softly. "Some doors don't close once you open them." She left the office with the photo still burning in her thoughts. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shining. As she walked toward her car, she could feel eyes on her from across the lot, curious, cautious, maybe even afraid. One thing was certain, whatever Mark was hiding, it wasn't just about guilt, it was about power. And Augusta had a long memory when it came to protecting its own. Lorraine Caldwell's house stood at the edge of town, wrapped in ivy and silence. 2 decades had passed since Emma's disappearance, yet nothing inside those walls had changed. The curtains were the same pale lace, the porch swing still creaked softly in the wind. Sarah hesitated at the gate, feeling a weight settle in her chest. This was where the truth had stopped breathing. Lorraine opened the door before Sarah could knock. Time had carved lines into her face, but her eyes, those same deep blue eyes Emma had, were still sharp. "I figured you'd come sooner or later," she said, voice steady but tired. Sarah managed a faint smile. "I didn't know if you'd want to see me." "I always do," Lorraine replied. "You were like a sister to her. Come in." The house smelled faintly of old books and lavender. Every shelf carried framed photos of Emma, her graduation portrait, her first ballet recital, her smile so bright it hurt to look at. Lorraine poured tea, her movements slow and deliberate, like someone performing a ritual. "I saw your article," she began. "Stirred some things up again. The phone's been ringing all morning." "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly. "I just want the truth, Lorraine." "The police didn't tell us everything." Lorraine's gaze lingered on the teacup in her hands. "No, they didn't. They told me to let it go, that digging would only make it harder." Sarah leaned forward. "Did Emma ever say anything strange before she disappeared? Anything that might matter now?" Lorraine hesitated, then rose from her chair. "There's something I kept." I wasn't sure if I should ever show it to anyone. She crossed the room and opened a small chest near the window. Inside was a faded leather journal tied with a blue ribbon. She handed it to Sarah with trembling fingers. "It's Emma's diary. I couldn't bring myself to read it." Sarah held it carefully, feeling its fragile weight. The pages were filled with looping handwriting, hopeful entries about college plans and prom dresses, until the tone shifted. The later pages spoke of confusion, of someone she couldn't name, but couldn't stay away from either. "She called him A," Sarah murmured. "She wrote that he was older, that people wouldn't understand." Lorraine nodded faintly, tears gathering but never falling. "I thought maybe it was just teenage drama. God knows we all had secrets at that age. But after she disappeared, I started wondering." Sarah's throat tightened. "You think she was seeing someone in secret?" "I know she was," Lorraine whispered. "I found a letter once, but I burned it. I couldn't bear to read the whole thing." Outside, thunder rumbled low, distant yet steady. The storm that had been building all week was finally breaking. Sarah closed the diary and looked up. "Lorraine, this changes everything. Whoever A was, he might have been with her that night." Lorraine's hands clenched around her teacup. "Find him," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Find whoever took her from me." Sarah nodded, her pulse quickening with both fear and resolve. As she stepped out into the rising wind, one thought echoed through her mind. The answers weren't lost, they'd been hidden. The rain had stopped by dawn, leaving the air thick and heavy with the smell of wet pine. Sarah drove toward the old quarry road, the one that twisted beyond the edge of Augusta, where the trees grew close and shadows lingered even in daylight. It was where Emma's car had been found 2 decades ago, empty, doors locked, keys still in the ignition. Lorraine's words from the night before echoed in her mind. Find him. Whoever A was, Sarah knew this place held part of the answer. The road grew narrower the deeper she went, red clay glistening beneath her tires. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as she saw the rusted "No Trespassing" sign, half swallowed by vines. She parked beside the clearing where weeds now covered the spot Emma's Mustang had once sat. The silence was unsettling. No birds, no wind, only the distant drip of water. Sarah stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. Every sound felt amplified, each breath too loud. "Not many folks come out here anymore," a voice called behind her. Sarah turned sharply. A man stood near the tree line, grey beard, trucker's cap pulled low. His jacket bore the faded logo of a long-haul company. He watched her carefully, not threatening, but wary. "You scared me," she said, trying to steady her breath. "I didn't think anyone else would be here." "Name's Charlie Dunn," he replied. "Used to haul timber down this road. You're not from the sheriff's office, are you?" "No, I'm a journalist," she said, showing him her press badge. "I'm looking into what happened here in 2002. Emma Caldwell." The man's eyes darkened with recognition. "That poor girl, I remember her. Whole town went crazy when they found her car here." But nobody wanted to talk about what they really saw. Sarah's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Charlie hesitated, glancing toward the woods. "That night, I was driving past here around midnight. Rain was coming down hard. I saw a car just like hers parked crooked by the ditch. Thought maybe she'd slid off the road, but when I slowed down there was another car behind it. Black sedan. Windows tinted. Did you see who was inside?" He shook his head. "Just silhouettes. Looked like someone in uniform, maybe a cop. I didn't think much of it then. Figured she was getting help. But the next morning, the news said she'd vanished. I told the deputies what I saw, but they told me to forget it." "Forget it," Sarah repeated, disbelief sharpening her tone. "Yeah," he said bitterly. "Said I must have been mistaken. But I know what I saw. That sedan wasn't from around here." Sarah felt the pieces shifting in her mind, the uniform in the photo, the missing evidence, the silence that followed. "Charlie, would you be willing to give a statement?" He shook his head quickly. "Not to the police. They already made it clear they don't want this coming up again. But I'll tell you this. If you keep digging, be careful. Folks who tried before didn't end up with much peace." Sarah looked back toward the woods. the pines whispering in the wind that had suddenly picked up. "I'm not looking for peace," she said quietly. "I'm looking for the truth." By the next morning, Augusta no longer felt like home. The streets Sarah once biked down as a teenager now watched her like silent witnesses, their shutters closed, their sidewalks empty. She drove past familiar houses, each one carrying a story, each one holding its silence. The town had learned to forget, and forgetting had become its way of surviving. Sarah stopped at Ray's diner, her mind still replaying Charlie Dunn's words. Inside, the air smelled of bacon and burnt coffee, just like always. Conversations hushed when she walked in. Heads turned, eyes followed. Some looked curious, others cautious, but a few, those who remembered too well, looked frightened. She took a booth near the window and opened her notebook, scribbling everything Charlie had told her. The sound of the door opening made her glance up. Becky Taylor approached, the same class president who had greeted her days earlier. Today, the friendliness was gone. "Sarah," Becky said quietly, sitting across from her, "you've got the whole town talking. People are saying you're stirring up trouble again." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Trouble? Asking questions about a missing girl isn't trouble." Becky sighed. "You know how things are here. Folks move on, they don't want the past dug up. Emma's case, it hurt a lot of people." "It hurt one person more than anyone," Sarah said sharply, "and she never got justice." Becky looked down, tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "You think justice still means something here? Sheriff Mason's been running this town for 20 years. The man's practically untouchable." Sarah leaned closer. "Maybe he shouldn't be." Before Becky could answer, a folded note slid under the edge of Sarah's notebook. She looked up, but whoever left it was already gone. The paper was thin, written in hurried pencil. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." Becky saw her expression change. "What's wrong?" Sarah folded the note and slipped it into her jacket. "Nothing," she said, though her heart pounded. Just another person afraid of the truth. That afternoon she returned to her motel. The parking lot was quiet except for the buzz of a broken streetlight. When she unlocked her door, she noticed something off. Her papers slightly rearranged, her laptop lid half open. She froze. Someone had been inside. Her stomach knotted as she checked her folder. The photograph of Emma was still there, but the diary, Emma's diary, was gone. "No," she whispered, panic rising. She searched everywhere, but the truth was immediate and brutal. Someone had taken it. Anger replaced fear. Whoever had broken in wasn't trying to scare her. They were trying to erase proof. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the rain beginning to fall again outside. The soft patter against the window almost drowned out her thoughts. Almost. If someone was watching her, it meant she was getting close. Too close. She pulled out her phone and began typing her notes faster, creating backups, emailing copies to herself. They could steal her files, her photos, even her peace, but not her determination. Augusta might have chosen to forget, but Sarah Monroe would not. The morning after the break-in, Sarah drove straight to Augusta High. The school loomed quiet under a pale sky, its flag limp in the still air. She'd called ahead, pretending to be writing an article on the school's history, hoping it would get her inside. The secretary, Mrs. Clemens, an elderly woman with a voice like creased paper, led her toward the archives room. "It's mostly trophies and yearbooks down there," Mrs. Clemens said, jingling a set of keys. "We don't get many visitors." Sarah smiled politely. "Just hoping to find something useful for my research." When the door clicked open, the smell of dust and cardboard filled the air. Rows of metal shelves stretched before her, stacked with files, tapes, and old equipment. Mrs. Clemens left her alone, locking the door behind her. Sarah's flashlight swept across boxes labeled Events, 1999-2004. Her fingers trailed along until she found one marked Prom Night 2002. Her pulse quickened. Inside were decorations, programs, and a handful of VHS tapes. Most were blank or labeled setup footage, but one tape stood out, black plastic, hand-labeled in faded ink. May 25th, Gym Exit. Her breath hitched. "Please let this be what I think it is." She found an old TV VCR combo in the corner and plugged it in. The static flickered, then steadied. The footage was grainy but clear enough. Students dancing, laughing, teachers patrolling. Time-stamped 11:38 p.m. Emma appeared on screen, her light blue dress glinting as she waved at someone off camera. Sarah leaned closer. The next few minutes showed Emma moving toward the exit doors. She wasn't alone. A tall figure followed her wearing a dark uniform. The man's face turned briefly toward the camera, Deputy Frank Holloway. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Holloway had been Sheriff Mason's right hand back then, a man everyone in Augusta trusted. The screen went dark for a moment, and when the picture returned, Emma and Frank were gone. Only the empty hallway remained. Her mind raced. The diary, the photo, the witness at the quarry, all of it pointed in the same direction. But this was proof. She rewound the tape, pausing at the moment Holloway's face was visible. His expression wasn't angry but uneasy, like a man doing something he wished he didn't have to. The image blurred slightly before the camera flickered again. A few seconds later, the timestamp jumped forward by several minutes. The footage had been edited. Sarah sat back, trembling. Someone had cut out the moment Emma disappeared. A noise echoed outside the door. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. She froze, holding her breath. The handle turned, then stopped. After a few tense seconds, the sound faded down the hallway. She ejected the tape and slipped it into her bag. If someone had gone through her motel room, they wouldn't hesitate to come here too. As she left the school, sunlight poured through the trees, but it offered no comfort. The truth was finally taking shape, and it carried a name, a badge, a face she had trusted. Sarah tightened her grip on her bag and whispered to herself, "You can't hide anymore, Frank." The sheriff's office stood at the edge of Augusta like an immovable monument to power, its stone facade cold and impassive. Sarah knew she had to confront Sheriff Mason, but the closer she got, the heavier her steps became. His reputation, the tight-knit control he had over the town, it was all starting to make sense. Every roadblock, every hesitation, every threat, it was all him. She parked outside, the cruiser with the sheriff's seal parked at the entrance. As she approached the front door, the heat of the afternoon sun pressed down on her, the humidity clinging to her skin like a warning. Inside, the air-conditioned coolness was a stark contrast, but the tension was palpable. Deputies looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and warning. Sheriff Mason was sitting behind his desk, his fingers laced together, his face calm and unreadable. The old man's eyes, however, were sharp, too sharp for someone who'd been in power for so long. He knew exactly why she was there. "You've been busy, Sarah," Mason said, his voice smooth, almost condescending. "I see you've been digging through old files. That's not something a good girl does." Sarah didn't flinch. "I'm not a good girl, Sheriff. I'm trying to understand why Emma Caldwell disappeared that night." He let out a long, slow breath, the kind of breath that felt rehearsed. "The past is dead and buried, Sarah. People have moved on. Why don't you do the same?" "People haven't moved on, not really," she shot back, her voice unwavering. "Not everyone has the luxury of forgetting. Emma didn't get that luxury. Her life was stolen, and you've been hiding the truth about what happened that night." Mason's smile tightened. He leaned forward, his eyes darkening. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I think I do," she replied, pulling out the photograph of Emma and the tape from the school archives. "I know about the photo, the video, and how you've been covering up your deputy's involvement in her disappearance." His expression shifted just for a moment, too quick to be a trick of the light. Then he leaned back, his fingers drumming the desk, his gaze steady but filled with a simmering threat. "You think you've figured it out, but you haven't. You've got pieces, sure, but they don't add up the way you think. You're playing with fire, Sarah." "I'm not playing," Sarah said, her voice cold. "I'm telling the truth. And the truth is your department failed Emma. You failed her. Frank Holloway failed her." The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "I'll make this simple for you. Stop this nonsense now. If you keep pushing, if you keep digging, I'll bury you just like we buried her memory. Do you understand me?" For a moment, Sarah didn't speak. She just stood there, the weight of his words hanging between them. But the more she stood, the more she realized something. She had already crossed the line. There was no turning back now. "I'm not afraid of you," she said firmly, meeting his gaze. "You're not the one who gets to decide when this ends. Emma's story ends when the truth comes out, and I'll make sure of it." Mason stared at her for a long time, his lips curled in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see how far that gets you," he said quietly. As Sarah turned to leave, she could feel his eyes burning into her back, the weight of his power following her like a shadow. But it didn't matter anymore. Sarah Monroe wasn't afraid. The weight of Sheriff Mason's words pressed down on Sarah like a storm cloud. He'd threatened her, sure, but it was the look in his eyes that stayed with her, the one that said he'd made people disappear before. She'd seen that kind of power, the kind that made people silence their own voices, forget their own truths and pretend things had never happened. But Sarah wasn't going to pretend anymore. It had been a week since her confrontation with Mason, and the walls of Augusta had started to close in around her. She could feel the heat of eyes following her, but she didn't care. She'd learned enough to know there was one more person she needed to confront, Mark Rivers. He had always been close to the sheriff. Too close. As Emma's boyfriend, Mark had been a part of that night, and yet he'd been one of the first to claim he had no idea where Emma went after the dance. That didn't sit right anymore. Sarah found him sitting at his desk in the deputy's office. The place looked exactly as she remembered, cold, sterile, and lined with photographs of local events, but it felt different now. Everything felt different. Mark glanced up as she entered. His eyes were tired, like a man who hadn't slept in a while. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough. "I didn't think I'd see you here again." "I didn't think I'd be back either," she replied, her voice steady, though her heart raced. "But I need answers, Mark. I need to know what really happened that night." He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. "We've been through this. I told you everything I knew." Sarah set the photograph of Emma and the tape on his desk. "Did you?" she asked quietly. "Did you really tell me everything?" Mark's hands trembled slightly, his gaze flickering toward the door. "You don't know what you're asking, Sarah. There's things that you've been keeping quiet about for years," Sarah interrupted. "I saw the tape, Mark. I know you were with Emma. I know you were the last one to see her before she disappeared. And I know you didn't tell anyone." He swallowed hard, looking at the photo with a mix of guilt and regret. "I didn't want to believe it, okay? I didn't want to believe Frank could have done anything to her. But the sheriff, he made it clear. If I spoke out, I'd lose everything." "Everything?" Sarah echoed, her voice rising. "What about Emma? What did you lose? A career?" "A reputation." Mark slammed his fist onto the desk, the sound loud in the quiet room. "I lost her, Sarah. I lost everything the day she was taken, but that's not something I can change, and neither can you." Sarah's anger flared, but she forced herself to stay calm. "You're wrong, Mark. I can change it. You can change it. But you have to stop protecting people who don't deserve your loyalty." "Frank Holloway, the sheriff, they're the ones who should be held accountable." Mark's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at the desk like he was lost. "I can't make you speak up, Mark," Sarah said quietly, "but I can tell you this. If you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows the truth. Everyone." She turned to leave, but paused at the door. "You're not the man I thought you were," she added, "but maybe you still have a chance to do the right thing." She didn't wait for his response. As she walked out of the deputy's office, the weight on her shoulders didn't feel as heavy. It wasn't over, but for the first time she felt like it might be close. The night felt heavier than usual, as if the storm that had been brewing in Augusta for so long was finally ready to break. Sarah sat in her car, the engine running but the air inside thick with tension. She hadn't slept much, but tonight wasn't about sleep. It was about the truth, and she was about to get it whether she was ready or not. She drove toward the edge of town, where the old empty roads twisted like forgotten secrets. Her phone buzzed once, a text from an unknown number. "You don't want to do this, Sarah. Drop it before it's too late." Her hands tightened around the wheel, but she didn't reply. She'd come too far. As she turned onto a dirt road, she spotted the figure standing near the old warehouse by the edge of the woods. Charlie Dunn, the man who had seen something, who had known more than he'd let on. He'd called her earlier, asking to meet. She parked, stepped out, and approached him. Charlie stood with his back to her, facing the dark woods, a cigarette dangling from his lips. The smell of tobacco and wet earth mixed in the air. "You came," he said without turning around. His voice was hoarse, like someone who hadn't spoken in too long. "I came because you said you had something important to tell me," Sarah replied. Charlie exhaled a long cloud of smoke. "I didn't want to say it before. Hell, I didn't want to say it now, but you're too damn close to the truth and you're gonna need this." He turned slowly, eyes shadowed in the dim light. "You want to know what happened that night? You want to know who took Emma Caldwell? It wasn't just Frank Holloway." Sarah's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "Frank didn't do it on his own. He wasn't the only one there that night. Sheriff Mason was involved too." Sarah's mind raced, trying to process the words. "Mason," she whispered. "You're saying the sheriff was there?" Charlie nodded grimly. "I saw him that night. I was parked by the quarry, waiting for a truck to pass, when I saw Mason's car. I saw him and Frank together talking to Emma. She was arguing with them about something, I don't know what. I only heard parts of the conversation, but I know what I saw." Sarah stepped closer. "What did you hear?" Charlie shook his head. "I can't say everything, but I saw Mason. He didn't want to let her go. He was mad. And after that, she was never seen again. They covered it up. They made sure no one would find out what happened in those woods." Sarah's chest tightened. This was the confession she'd been searching for. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I can't live with it anymore. I've been keeping it all inside, and I'm tired of watching people suffer because of what they did." "You want to find Emma? You want justice? Then you need to bring down the sheriff. The real story is with him, not just Frank." Sarah took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "How can you be sure?" Charlie's face darkened. "Because I was there. I saw it happen. And if you keep pushing, they'll come after you, just like they came after everyone else who tried to speak the truth." Sarah stood silently, the weight of his words sinking in. "I'm not going to stop," she said softly. "I'll expose them. I promise you that." Charlie looked at her one last time, then turned and walked into the darkness, disappearing into the night like a ghost. Sarah stood there for a moment, her mind reeling. The storm was coming, and she was ready. The town of Augusta had never felt so suffocating. The heat, the tension in the air, it all pressed down on Sarah like a weight she couldn't escape. It had been days since her conversation with Charlie, and while the confession about Sheriff Mason had fueled her resolve, it had also made the walls close in tighter. Everyone seemed to be watching, waiting for her to slip, to back down. But Sarah wasn't backing down, not now, not when the truth was so close. She sat at her desk, scrolling through the countless notes, articles, and interviews she'd gathered. The pieces were finally starting to connect, too many pieces for anyone to ignore. Emma's disappearance, the cover-up, the town's complicity. It was all tied together in a web that went higher than she'd ever imagined. Her phone buzzed on the desk, and she hesitated before picking it up. It was a text from Mark Rivers. "I can't do this anymore. You're right. Meet me tonight. There's more you need to know." Sarah's stomach churned. She had a feeling this was coming, the final piece of the puzzle, the last confession. But what would Mark say? What could he possibly have to add that would change everything? The sun was low in the sky as she drove to the meeting place, an old abandoned barn just outside town. The weathered wood of the barn stood like a sentry in the fading light, a place that had once been full of life and laughter, now just a shadow of its former self. She parked a little ways off, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying wood. The evening breeze rustled the tall grass, but everything else was still, silent. Sarah stepped out of the car, her heart pounding in her chest. The ground beneath her boots crunched as she walked toward the barn, the sound echoing in the empty space. She reached the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. Mark was standing near the far wall, his back to her. His posture was rigid, and his shoulders were hunched like he was carrying the weight of the world. He didn't turn when she approached. "I'm here," she said quietly. He nodded, but didn't speak at first. The silence between them was suffocating, full of years of guilt, fear, and unspoken truths. Emma was right about Frank, Mark finally said, his voice thick with emotion. She found out things, Sarah. Things that could have ruined everything, but the sheriff and he made it clear. He said if I didn't help cover it up, I'd be next. Sarah's breath caught. You helped him? You helped them cover it up? Mark nodded slowly. I didn't know what to do. I was scared. I thought if I kept quiet, things would go back to normal. But they never did. Not for me. Not for Emma. And not for anyone in this town. His words were like a slap to the face. Sarah had known that fear had driven Mark to silence, but hearing him admit it out loud, seeing the regret in his eyes, made the reality of it hit harder than she could have prepared for. Mark, this is bigger than you, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of frustration and sorrow. This isn't just about protecting yourself anymore. This is about Emma. This is about justice for her. I know, he whispered. I know. And I'm done hiding. But you need to be careful, Sarah. If you push too hard, they'll come after you. They won't stop. Sarah took a deep breath, the weight of his words sinking in. She had come too far to stop now. I'm not afraid, she said, her voice firm. It's time everyone knew the truth. The sky above Augusta had turned a steely grey, as if it too could feel the weight of the secrets that had been buried for so long. Sarah sat in her car, staring at the dirt road ahead. The trees along the path swayed, their branches moving like fingers brushing the air. It was quiet here, almost too quiet. But she knew this place. She had been here as a child, playing in these woods, feeling safe. Now it felt like the last place she would ever find peace. She had finally gathered enough courage to follow the last lead Charlie had given her, the location where Emma's body had been hidden. Her heart beat harder with each mile, the tension in her chest thickening. She couldn't go back. Not after everything she had learned. Not after all the lives that had been destroyed to keep the truth from surfacing. Sarah parked at the edge of the clearing, the overgrown grass swaying with the wind. She got out of the car, feeling the damp earth beneath her boots as she stepped toward the woods. Her breath came out in short, shallow bursts. She had come this far. There was no turning back. The trees seemed to close in around her, the air thick with the scent of pine and wet earth. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of her footsteps crunching on the forest floor. She walked further, past the spot where she had once played with Emma, past the memories of their laughter and carefree days, and then she saw it, a small clearing, barely visible through the dense underbrush. The ground was disturbed, the soil turned over in a way that didn't belong. Sarah's stomach twisted as she walked toward it, her heart hammering in her chest. There, partially covered by branches and leaves, was a small wooden cross. It was simple, crude, and weathered by time, but there was no mistaking it. This was where Emma had been laid to rest. Sarah knelt beside the cross, her hands trembling as she touched the earth. Her thoughts swirled, anger, grief, regret. She had found Emma, but it felt like she had lost her all over again. Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't wipe them away. Emma had been just a girl, full of life and dreams, and she deserved so much more than this. This wasn't justice. It was the painful conclusion to a story that had been stolen from her. But it wasn't over. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the photograph, the one that had been with her through it all. The photo of Emma and the man in the uniform. The photo that had started everything. It was time to make sure Emma's voice was heard. I promise you, Emma, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. They'll know the truth. You'll get justice. I'll make sure of it. As Sarah stood and looked at the grave one last time, a sense of resolve filled her. Emma's story had never been just hers to tell. It was for everyone who had been silenced. And now Sarah would make sure it was heard. She turned and walked back toward her car, the weight of the past no longer holding her down. Emma had been found. Now, the town would have to face the truth. The morning after the discovery, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, the sunlight creeping through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. She hadn't slept much, but the exhaustion didn't matter now. The truth had finally been unearthed. Emma Caldwell was no longer a ghost of the past. She was a story that would be told again and again until everyone who had been complicit paid the price. Sarah's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was an email from her editor, an invitation to a press conference that had been scheduled for later that afternoon. The email was short, but the message was clear. The sheriff has stepped down. The investigation is reopening. For a moment, Sarah could only sit there, the weight of those words sinking in. After all the years of silence, after the threats, the secrets, and the pain, it was finally happening. Sheriff Mason had resigned. Frank Holloway, too, would face charges. The truth had broken free, like a flood that had been dammed for far too long. She pulled herself up from the table, taking a deep breath. The work wasn't over, not yet. She still had to attend the press conference. She had to make sure that the final chapter of Emma's story was written with integrity. At the press conference, cameras flashed like a storm, capturing the faces of the people who had once kept their heads low. There was Mark Rivers, standing beside the police chief, his face pale, his eyes haunted. He looked like a man who had seen too much, a man who had finally been forced to face the truth. And there was Lorraine Caldwell, Emma's mother, standing next to Sarah. Her face was still marked by the years of grief, but there was a flicker of relief in her eyes now. Emma's name was no longer a question. It was a call for justice. The press conference began with a brief statement from the new sheriff, a man who had taken over after Mason's resignation. He promised transparency, accountability, and the commitment to bringing justice for Emma. "We cannot change the past," the new sheriff said, his voice calm and measured. "But we can honor Emma's memory by making sure nothing like this ever happens again." The reporters erupted with questions, but Sarah's gaze was fixed on Lorraine. The woman had waited 20 years to hear those words, to see that the system could finally right its wrong. Then it was Sarah's turn to speak. She stepped up to the podium, the weight of her words heavy. The crowd quieted as she looked out over the sea of faces. Emma Caldwell was a child, a bright young woman with a future ahead of her, Sarah began, her voice steady but emotional. She was taken from her family, from her friends, and from this town, and for too long the truth was hidden, buried beneath lies and silence, but no longer. Justice has been served today, but it's not just for Emma, it's for all of us who believe that the truth is worth fighting for. She paused, letting the gravity of the moment sink in. This isn't just about one case. It's about a community learning to trust itself again. It's about standing up to power, no matter how strong it seems, and demanding accountability. The room was still, the weight of her words settling over the crowd. For the first time in years, it felt like the people of Augusta could breathe again. After the press conference, Lorraine approached Sarah. Her eyes were full of tears, but her smile was genuine, a soft reflection of the peace she had been denied for so long. "I'll never be able to thank you enough," Lorraine said, her voice breaking. "Emma would have been so proud of you." Sarah smiled back, her heart swelling. "You're welcome, Lorraine." It was worth every step. As Sarah watched Lorraine walk away, she felt something shift within her, a sense of closure, of finality. Emma's story had been heard, and justice had been served, but this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the cemetery. It had been a week since the press conference, a week since the truth had finally been revealed. The town of Augusta was still waking up from its long, silent sleep, slowly starting to grapple with the fallout of what had been exposed. The silence was gone now, replaced by whispers of change. Sarah stood at the edge of the small graveyard, the wind tugging at her jacket as she watched Lorraine Caldwell kneeling beside Emma's grave. The gravestone was simple, a plain marker with Emma's name etched into the stone, but to Lorraine, it was everything. It was the place where the pain could begin to heal, where the daughter she had lost could finally be remembered properly. Sarah took a deep breath and walked toward them, her footsteps soft on the grass. Lorraine looked up as she approached, her eyes still wet with tears, but filled with something else now. Peace. "Sarah," Lorraine said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe it's finally over." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "It's over, Lorraine. She's finally home." The two women stood together looking at the gravestone, the weight of the last few weeks pressing down on them. They had fought for this moment, for the chance to give Emma a voice when so many had tried to silence it. It wasn't perfect, but it was justice. "I still can't believe it," Lorraine whispered, almost to herself. "After all these years, I thought I'd never get this, never get to know what happened to my little girl." Sarah reached out and placed a hand gently on Lorraine's shoulder. "You did, Lorraine. You did." They stood in silence for a moment longer, the wind rustling through the leaves, the world turning slowly around them. The past couldn't be erased, but the future was theirs to shape. "I made a promise to Emma," Sarah said softly, "that I would get to the truth, that I would make sure people knew what happened to her. And I kept that promise." Lorraine turned to Sarah, her face softening with a grateful smile. "You did more than that. You gave me back my daughter's memory. You gave me the chance to finally say goodbye." Sarah's eyes stung, the weight of the journey finally catching up to her. She had started this fight as a journalist, a seeker of truth, but now, standing beside Lorraine, she realized it had been about so much more than that. It had been about giving a family back what was lost, about restoring a piece of the past that could never be replaced. "I'll always be here for you, Lorraine," Sarah promised, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. "You won't ever have to fight alone again." Lorraine nodded, her hands trembling as she touched the gravestone one last time. "Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for everything." As Sarah walked away, she glanced back one final time at the grave. Emma's story had ended with truth and justice, but for Sarah it felt like a new chapter was just beginning. She had kept her promise. Now, it was time to move forward, to write the next story, one where truth wasn't buried but celebrated. The town would remember, and so would she.